For years, one of the most important assumptions underpinning global markets has been remarkably simple. When China's economy slows, Beijing stimulates. Property weakness, stimulate. Consumers pull back, stimulate. Growth falls below target, stimulate. And eventually, Chinese demand comes roaring back. That assumption has shaped everything from commodity forecasts to expectations for oil, metals, and global trade. But what if that assumption is no longer correct? Because increasingly, I think we're seeing something quite different. China appears willing to tolerate weaker economic growth for much longer than many outside China expected. And this isn't necessarily because Beijing has run out of options. It may be because its priorities have changed. China increasingly seems prepared to trade some near-term growth for something it considers more valuable: financial stability, industrial resilience, and strategic independence. And if that is right, it has major implications not just for China, but for the US, commodity markets, and the global economy. So the old China playbook is changing. Let's start with the domestic economy. China's property downturn is no longer a normal cyclical slowdown. Housing values have fallen significantly from their 2021 peak, and there is little reason to assume that the sector is about to return to its former role as the engine of Chinese growth. That matters because property wasn't simply another industry. Housing and everything connected to it accounted for a huge share of household wealth and consumption. So when property weakens, the impact spreads. Consumers feel poor. Developers invest less. Local governments lose land sale revenues. Construction falls. And demand for everything from steel to copper to appliances and furniture suffers. The conventional expectation would therefore be Beijing to respond with massive stimuli. But that isn't really what we're seeing. Instead, policymakers appear much more focused on debt resolution, financial stability, and restructuring. And that tells us something important. Beijing seems increasingly willing to accept slower growth rather than recreate the debt-fueled economic model that contributed to the problem in the first place. In other words, China may no longer be trying to maximize growth. It may be trying to optimize resilience. And politics helps explain why. Now, this becomes easier to understand when you look at China's political calendar. The next Chinese People's Party Congress is in 2027, next year, and political stability will become increasingly important as that approaches. Xi Jinping is widely expected to seek another term. That means Beijing has strong incentives to avoid destabilizing economic experiments. Large-scale structural reforms can create winners and losers. Let's take property taxes, for example. This may make economic sense in the long term, but they can be politically difficult when households are already dealing with declining property values. Aggressive deleveraging can create financial instability. An enormous consumer stimulus could undermine Beijing's long-term objective of reducing dependence on debt. So the preference appears to be, for now, control. Resolve debt gradually, support strategic industries, protect employment where possible, maintain financial stability, and accept lower growth if necessary. From Beijing's perspective, that may actually be rational. But from the perspective of global markets, this creates a very different China. Which brings us to the United States. At the same time now, relations between Washington and Beijing remain remarkably fragile. There had been some hope that 2026 could produce a more stable phase in the relationship, but that optimism has weakened. And one of the biggest emerging sources of tension is not tariffs, it's artificial intelligence. The US is increasingly concerned about the speed of China's AI development and the possibility that China could close parts of the technological gap faster than expected. That creates pressure for further restrictions, potentially involving advanced AI models, semiconductors, robotics, drones, and other cutting-edge technologies. And from Beijing's perspective, these measures reinforce a conclusion it has already been drawing for years. China cannot assume continued access to Western tech. That changes the economic calculation. If Beijing believes strategic competition with the US is structural rather than temporary, then maximizing GDP today becomes less important than controlling the tech and supply chains China may need tomorrow. Semiconductors, AI, batteries, EVs, rare earths, industrial machinery, these are no longer simply economic sectors. These are becoming instruments of national power. And China has leverage of its own. This is perhaps one of the most underestimated developments. For years, discussion about economic coercion between China and the West focused overwhelmingly on Western leverage. The US controls advanced tech. It controls access to parts of the global financial system. And together with its Western allies, it can restrict semiconductor equipment and other critical tech. All that remains important. But China has spent decades building leverage of its own. There are roughly around 300 intermediate goods where China has more than 50% of global market share. Now just think about what that means. These are not necessarily finished consumer products. They're often the components, the processed materials and industrial inputs that other countries need to manufacture their own products. And that creates a different kind of power. If China restricts the export of a consumer good, a buyer can sometimes find alternatives. But if China controls a critical upstream input, the disruption travels through the entire supply chain. Production slows, costs rise, factories struggle to source components, and the impact may only become visible weeks or months later. We've already seen versions of this strategy through controls on critical minerals and rare earth-related supply chains. And that suggests the economic confrontation between China and the West is entering a new phase. The first phase was about tariffs. The next phase may increasingly be about control of the inputs required to build the modern economy. So Xi Jinping is about to visit the US next month on the 24th of September. What should we expect from his visit? Now this is where expectations need to be realistic. A meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump could still be significant, but I would not expect it to be fundamentally to resolve the strategic competition between the two countries. The more realistic objective is management rather than resolution. There are several areas where progress appears possible. The two sides can reaffirm mechanisms designed to prevent the relationship from deteriorating further. There could be Chinese purchase commitments, potentially involving areas such as agriculture or aviation. There could be working groups around trade. There may be cooperation on fentanyl enforcement, and existing trade arrangements on truces could potentially be extended. Those would be meaningful, but they're not the same thing as resolving the underlying conflict. The structural issues remain: technology, Taiwan, industrial policy, supply chains, military competition, economic security, and increasingly AI. So the best outcome may simply be to put guardrails around the competition. Not peace, not rapprochement, just a more predictable rivalry. But there's another important consequence: commodities. And this is where the China story becomes particularly relevant for energy markets. For years, commodity markets have been conditioned to look towards China whenever global demand weakens. China was the marginal buyer. Its stimulus could rescue copper, its construction could lift steel demand, its refiners could absorb crude. But we need to be much more careful with that assumption now. China can still import enormous volumes of these commodities, and those imports can certainly increase. But rising Chinese commodity imports do not necessarily mean Chinese consumers are recovering. China may buy crude because it considers the price attractive. It may build strategic inventories. It may stockpile metals because policymakers are concerned about future supply disruption. These are very different signals from a consumer-led economic rebound, and that distinction matters enormously, because if China is prioritizing resilience over growth, it could simultaneously have weak household consumption, a depressed property sector, and very large commodity imports. Those things are not contradictory, they're part of the same strategy of China. And there's also a bigger geopolitical shift. China's strategy increasingly appears designed around a world in which economic interdependence can be weaponized. The US can restrict access to advanced chips. Europe can impose trade measures. China can restrict critical minerals. Shipping lanes can be disrupted by geopolitical conflict. Energy flows become bargaining chips. Sanctions can cut countries off from markets almost overnight. In that world, the rational objective isn't necessarily maximum efficiency, it's minimum vulnerability, and that is a profound change. For decades, globalization encouraged countries to build the cheapest possible supply chains. Now geopolitical competition is encouraging them to build the safest ones. Those are not the same thing. Efficiency encourages concentration. Security encourages redundancy. Efficiency encourages dependence on the cheapest supplier. Security encourages domestic production, stockpiles, and alternative suppliers. And China appears to be preparing for that world where security beats efficiency. So where does this leave us? I think there are three conclusions worth keeping in mind. First, do not assume China's next slowdown automatically produces another massive stimulus cycle. Beijing appears more tolerant of weak growth than it was about a decade ago. Second, don't interpret every increase in Chinese commodity imports as evidence of an economic recovery, because of that buying may increasingly reflect strategic stockpiling, industrial policy, rather than stronger consumer demand. And finally, the third major point, US-China competition is moving beyond tariffs. The more consequential confrontation is increasingly about AI, tech, critical minerals, and control over industrial supply chains. And that competition is much harder to resolve through a traditional trade agreement. So, in conclusion, we can see that for the past 20 years, the question that most economists asked about China was, how fast can China grow? I'm not sure that's the most useful question anymore. The better question may be, what kind of economy is China trying to build? And increasingly, the answer appears to be one that can withstand a much more hostile geopolitical environment. That may mean accepting weaker property markets. It may mean tolerating slower consumption growth. It could also mean accepting lower headline GDP growth, because Beijing increasingly seems to be making a different trade. Less growth today in exchange for greater resilience tomorrow. And if that assessment is correct, then the implications go far beyond China. It changes how we think about commodity demand, about the US-China relationship. It changes the role of supply chains in geopolitical competition. It means the world may need to stop waiting for the old China growth model to come back, because China itself has already moved on. Thank you.